the vibe you've been getting from your colleagues today? How is everybody feeling?
The vibe is actually a lot of anticipation, and a lot of us are frustrated that it's been the narrative of Attorney General Barr. This is a hearing for the American people to see every moment, the American people to see democracy, Congress doing its work. See, I love her when she's in here because I think she brings a calm energy, to the room.
The president called Sessions at his home and asked if he would unrecuse himself. Is that not true?
It's true.
Any surprised so far by how much or how little he's saying?
I assumed he's going to try to stick to yes or no answers as much as possible.
Yeah.
I knew he was going to be that reluctant to agree to anything that he couldn't verify 100% at the moment on the spot.
And you're on page 103?
103, that's correct, volume 2.
I'm hoping that somebody gets him to admit to what he says in his report, and he also said in his statement, now that my work is done, my report is done, others have responsibilities, such as Congress has a responsibility.
It's on you guys.
Exactly. I hope that he repeats that because that's one of the things that I think that people who are trying to defend the president and his actions and his team's actions, they're trying to make it seem like this is something that needs to be sealed and put away. And that is not the responsibility of the checks and balances the way I read it. The checks and balances require Congress to look into and to decide whether or not there's wrongdoing going on with any other branch of government. In this case, the administration, the President of the United States.
The president still tried to get the Attorney General to unrecuse himself after you were appointed special counsel. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's the way you need to ask Mueller questions. Read directly from his report, word for word, and then ask him. If you'll notice, he's giving yes, no answers.
Page 78 of volume 2, the president told Sessions, you were supposed to protect me. You were supposed to protect me, or words to that effect.
Correct.
I wish what we could get is Mueller to just read the report in its entirety, kind of like the audio version of the book.
Audio book.
May I finish?
Well, you're not answering my question. Did you order an investigation into deletion and reformatting of their government phones?
Gohmert loves to yell. That's all he does in committee, on the floor of the House of Representatives. He just yells, yells, yells. Hey, how you doing? How you doing? Sit down, sit down, sit down. We're watching the last few minutes.
Also interesting that he's coming under fire from his own party much more than
Exactly. They'll do anything to discredit. Exactly. They'll do anything to discredit anybody.
It's hard for them to deal with the facts. So instead, you don't like the message, you go after the messenger. That's what they're doing.
And that's Donald Trump's playbook right there. Just attack individuals, attack individuals.
How do you think your colleagues on the other side of the aisle are doing in their line of questioning? Do you think they're achieving what they set out to achieve today?
I don't know if they're achieving what they want to achieve, but I think that what they want to achieve is they want to discredit Mueller, and they want to make it seem like the report is all about nothing. I don't think they're going to be successful in that.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.